Next setting we have is scattering, and this one is actually pretty straightforward. So let me turn it off by clicking on the image there. Let me turn off the Batman, make new layer real quick. We still have the Batman text capture from the previous video, and right now we have nothing on except for smoothing at the default. And under brush tip, looks like we've got spacing at 400 some percent, which seems a bit extreme, but it seems to be working okay in this case. And that's about it. That's all that's going on. So it just stamps out Batman. And you can see, oh, I see why. So on Batman itself, that percentage is enough to go left to right without any overlap. Going down, you can see that there's about 4 spaces of Batman, which makes up the 400%. And so I forgot that it's in a square. This is interesting that it is actually in a square rather than just a little rectangular Batman. I'd have to review the previous video to see how we captured it to find out why that's the case. But something to keep in mind, sometimes the percentage is going to be referencing not just the side to side. Well, actually, all the time, it won't just be referencing the side to side, this spacing percentage, but also the up and down. So occasionally, you may have a very high percentage and you'll be looking and thinking, well, that doesn't seem to be too far away. But then when you go up and down, you can see where it's happening. Anyway, I think that's just interesting. Let you do Control A and delete to clear out that layer. I move down to scattering. Now that scattering is on, it looks like right now we have 100% scatter. And we can see that Batman indeed is in the preview going up to, he's just going up and down. He's not going left and right by default, or so it seems. We'll test that in a moment. And it looks like it's going up 100% and down 100%. So that should work out well for us. See how I go in a straight line, but the Batmen pop up and down around that straight line. So that's all that the scattering is doing at 100%. If you turn on both axes, guess what happens? Right now we're scattering around the, scattering up and down on the y-axis. Should also scatter on the x-axis, which means, sure enough, notice how Batman is occasionally overlapping himself as I draw a straight line of Batman. So there we have it. That's what that does. Pretty straightforward. Sure enough, we have controls. These controls behave exactly as before with shape dynamics. If I used fade, it would have the number of Batman fade down. So let's do 3. And so now 1, 2, 3, and now it's a straight line of Batman. So in this case, rather than the size shrinking down to 0, we have the scattering shrinking down to no scattering just after 3 clicks. And you can have as many as you want. And instead of fade, you could have it be pen pressure, pen tilt, stylus wheel, rotation, dial, any of those good things. My pen has good pressure, so let's do a quick test with pen pressure. And we can, it's a little hard to see with all those Batmen. Just draw a straight line with very little pressure, draw a straight line with a lot of pressure, draw a straight line with varying pressure. And there you can see. Sure enough, the scattering occurs more strongly as I increase the pressure, and it occurs less as I decrease the pressure. Now, this should be controlled still by the scattering up here. So if I were to, the scattering percentage up here. So if I turned off both axes for a moment and cleared this out, I could increase the scattering to some ludicrous amount and set it to pen pressure. Here it is with very little pen pressure. It's getting a ton. Here's a lot of pen pressure, and it's flying everywhere with a ludicrous amount. So this interests me because even with a very tiny amount of pen pressure, it's still getting a lot of scattering. It seems that at 1000%, it's very sensitive. It flies off the bat, at least in this version of Photoshop. I'd recommend playing around with each version every time you get a new version of Photoshop. Play around with it and see what might have changed. It's never a bad idea. So let's go ahead and do a 100% scatter, and I'll just clear this out again. Let's set this to off for the scatter. So now it will just be a random amount of scatter. Notice we have count. Now what does count do? This is actually pretty straightforward. Let's just increase it to 2. Now we have 2 Batmen scattering away from Batman. If we crank it up to 3, guess what will happen? Sure enough, we have up to 3 Batmen occurring. And if I remember correctly, we actually have up to that. So if we do a crazy number, like, well, let's just keep it a little small, 15. It seems as though it's randomly, that's too many for me to see, but it seems as though it can go up to that number. Let's just do 5, but not necessarily always have that number. On the other hand, it could just be that they're overlapping. Let's take a quick look. Just curious in this version. Looks like we've got 1, 2, 3, 4 Batman. So yeah, it appears at least that it goes up to that amount of randomization. Otherwise, it's just occasionally randomizing it so that they're right over each other. It's close to the same result. The times that there would be a difference, where that would make a difference whether they're overlapping or not, would be if your brush is set to something other than normal mode. Keep in mind, way back in like the first class we talked about this, it's possible to set these modes to be different. And also keep in mind that when you paint directly on something in a mode as compared to painting on a layer that's in the mode, depending on the version of Photoshop, you could get a different effect. And you can change that by coming in here and changing the let me see, should be the transparency shape layer, but I'm not seeing that unless, oh no, it's right here, I just missed it. Here's the transparency shape layer. Having this on means that they should behave the same, and off means that they won't behave the same. And let me check my instructions. Let's see, yeah. Although on some versions of Photoshop, by default it will be off, and by others it will be on. And these days I don't trust Adobe that much, so it's always a good idea to flip that switch from time to time and test it. For this class, don't worry about that yet. We'll talk about this much later when we go over all the blending modes. That's still a few weeks out, so you don't have to worry about that right now. But just keep this in mind. It's possible to get different effects with blending modes on your brush depending on how the layer is set. So that's always a little interesting to me. All right, back to the scattering. If you have a blending mode on, if they're scattering right on top of each other and they're at, for example, multiply, and you have different colors occurring, then yeah, that will make a difference. If you have them exactly 100% black and it's on normal mode, whether it's actually creating 4 Batmen or 5 Batmen and the 5 Batmen are just stacked on top of each other, it won't make a difference to you. All right, so let me clear that out. So that's what count does. Guess what count jitter does? This one absolutely changes the number going on, which makes me more suspicious that it in fact did have 5 and we just couldn't see it. You can see that in some cases we have 2 Batmen. In other cases we have 3. It's because we're bouncing all the way up. You can also do crazy stuff like have a huge number and then a high count jitter. And let's clear this out. And you get some wild effects going on. Now keep in mind we're just doing this on one axis right now. You can do both and just get this little pile going on, which is an interesting way to make textures pretty quickly. It's just to play with the scattering. All right, that's oh, don't forget that you also have a count jitter control, including fade, which means that you can knock it down pretty quickly. And now we're getting only one Batman going across the axes. And if we click on it and delete it, look at that. After 5 steps of up to 13 different Batmen, we go down to just 1 Batman. Crazy, right? I think that's pretty fun. All right, so that's essentially how scattering works. Having a little bit of scattering is a good way to add a sort of randomized effect to things. Well, it's clearly randomizing it, but if you, for example, had a brush that was kind of static, maybe a little too static, you could add in some scattering on it, and then you could increase or decrease just a bit. Add a little bit of jitter. All right, check this out. Doesn't that look a little more organic? What if we add on both axes? This is starting to look more like blobs of paint rather than a stamp that's repeating itself. A little bit of scattering can go a long way in a lot of cases. Now, I find scattering useful when you do want to have that kind of blobby, jittery effect. It also tends to work well with objects that have gray in it. In this case, it was pure black and white. But if we were to go in and create a new one, we'll just do again at 1 inch by 1 inch. And let me flip this over to white. And instead of 100% white, I'll just do like 30%. Scatter that out a little bit. And then flip it to black. So we'll have a bit harder area right in the middle. Now, another good thing in this case, notice how the hard edge is occurring here because it's just getting cut off. I'm going to do white at 100% and just going to paint right at the edge so that we don't have any flat pixels going on, which I feel as though it would cause kind of an ugly effect. Okay, so now we have built a nice little capture brush. I'm going to go up to edit. I'm going to go down to define brush preset. And then I get this nice little capture brush. I should have named it something other than sample brush, but I did not. Let me pop back over here. We'll cut this out, switch it to black. Now, by default, it's covering itself and it's not all that interesting. Just adding in scattering though, on both axes. Higher count would be nice, with a good jitter on it. Now we can see that gray effect occurring on the side, which I think makes for a more interesting brush, depending on how you're painting and what you're planning on painting. Different brushes work well for different people, and sometimes you'll find yourself making a brush and thinking it's amazing, and later on wishing that you had built a better brush. I think this would be good for clouds, looking over at this. If you wanted to just paint one on, if we started with a blue sky and then started painting up. It also has a nice effect. With a few adjustments, this could be good for mountain ranges too. That might be nice. So there's a lot of possibilities. I think this is actually a pretty good brush. So I'm going to take a moment to store this brush by clicking the flyout menu and calling a new brush preset and calling this Digital Cloud Brush. All right, we've got a brush. Well done us. Okay, next up, let's take a look at some more settings.